One of my passions is interpreting Christ and the gospel in the Old Testament. I love to look at the New Testament and to see what the apostles say, how the apostles interpret their Old Testaments, and I love to look especially at Jesus and what he said and how he interpreted the Old Testament. And I want to begin by looking at something Jesus says about the Old Testament, particularly about this business with Jonah in Matthew chapter 12. So if you're familiar enough with your Bible, would you turn forward to Matthew 12 with me? And we'll just look at something ever so briefly here. And I want to start here because there's an elephant in the room as we begin, and the elephant is a whale. And so I want to look briefly here about what Jesus says about this business with this whale. But what he says in Matthew chapter 12 actually goes beyond the thing with the whale. But the thing with the whale and Jonah is a part of what he's saying. So anyway, Matthew chapter 12, at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry. They began to pick heads of grain and eat them. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." And he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for him to eat, nor those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are yet guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus has a confrontation with these Pharisees, and if you've read the Gospels, you're not surprised that one of these conflicts happens to be about this business of the Sabbath. What ought you to do or what ought you not to do on the Sabbath? And the Pharisees come and they criticize Jesus. "Your disciples are eating grain and picking the heads, and that kind of work isn't allowed on the Sabbath." And Jesus gives them two examples of times from the scriptures where people break the Sabbath, but apparently it's not that big of a deal. And both of them have to do with the house of God. He says first, this thing with David, he goes in and eats the bread of the presence in the temple, and that's okay. And then according to the book of Numbers, chapter 29, I think, it talks about the regulations and the different sacrifices that are performed day by day, week by week, including sacrifices that are performed on the Sabbath. And these priests have to perform these sacrifices on the Sabbath, and yet because it has to do with the temple, they're somehow allowed to do that. But don't miss what Jesus does there in verse 6. He escalates it. He says, here's what it says in the Old Testament about the temple and the Sabbath, but listen to this. Something greater than the temple is here. Someone greater than the temple is here, right? That's what Jesus says in John chapter 2. He says, you tear down this temple and you destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And they don't understand. He's talking about himself. Jesus is the presence of God with the people perfectly in a way that the temple could only hope to be a picture of. But that's not all Jesus says in Matthew chapter 12. If you follow down in Matthew chapter 12, he says not only is something greater than the temple here, but in verse 38, he picks it up, and some of the scribes and the Pharisees were talking to Jesus. They answered him, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except for the sign of the prophet Jonah." Now, Jesus isn't saying that asking God for a sign is evil in and of itself. Jesus knows their hearts. This is a question, this is a challenge from the Pharisees, much akin to what we saw this morning and last Lord's Day in the morning with the Pharisees and the Sadducees their quote, questions to Jesus, trying to trap him. This is a question not for their own edification. This is a question of accusation. They're trying to make Jesus do something. They're trying to make him listen to them. And he says, it's an evil and adulterous generation that seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. Verse 40, but just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And the men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. So early in the chapter, Jesus says something greater than the temple is here. Here he says something greater than Jonah is here. Verse 42, the queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. You see what Jesus is driving at? He says, look, something greater than the temple is here. Someone greater than the temple is here. It's me. And he says, something greater than Jonah, a prophet, someone greater than Jonah is here. It's me. Someone greater than Solomon the king is here. It's me. So Jesus takes the three offices of the Old Testament, the prophets, the priests, and the kings, and he says, look, I'm here and I'm greater. And in doing so, he mentions Jonah and this business with this fish in the same context of David and the temple, and in the same context of the queen of the south visiting Solomon. He doesn't blush. He doesn't take a breath in between. He just quotes the story about Jonah and assumes it. He doesn't stop to question it or to prove it. And so as we look at Jonah chapter 2 tonight, starting in chapter 1, verse 17, ending in chapter 2, verse 10, I'd love to read this quote for you. One author says this is the great tragedy of the book of Jonah, that a book which has made the means of one of the most sublime revelations of truth in the Old Testament known, should instead be known most only for its connection with a whale. And that's part of the distraction that that the world, that the evil one will use to get us from seeing what God is clearly saying to us in this book. And we can make the mistake on both sides of the aisle. The liberal can look at this and say, look, if someone's swallowed by a fish, that's absolutely nonsense. I have no time to listen to what is said here. The conservative, on the other hand, can get so distracted with the liberal that they spend all of their energy trying to decipher which species of fish it could have been that could swallow a man whole and preserve his life for 3 days. Both of those sides make the same mistake. They miss the same point. They are both an affront to the miraculous and to the power of God. That's not what God is concerned with. What God is concerned with here is that he appointed this fish in the same way that he appointed the storm, in the same way that he appoints the worm later in the story, in the same way that he appoints the plant, he appoints this fish. So let's not miss what God is doing because of our questions about marine biology, okay? And so as we look at it, chapter 2 of Jonah is largely this prayer of distress. By way of organization, as you think of somebody's prayer, or even if you're going to compare this to a psalm, that's difficult to outline. If you really need an outline, verse 2 is a summary. Verses 3 through 6a are Jonah's distress, 6b and 7, Jonah's deliverance, verse 8 and 9, Jonah's declaration. But I don't think we're to take this text and to break it down into its parts. I think we're to take it as a whole. So what we'll hope to do is to walk through the text and make some observations along the way, and then hopefully point out one glaring conundrum that has to be settled by the time we finish this. But verse 2 says, Jonah called out to the Lord out of his distress, and the Lord answered him. Jonah is now praying from the belly of a fish to his God, the Lord his God, it says in verse 1. Out of the belly of the fish, he says, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me, which is very interesting if you read the first chapter. Because if you read the first chapter, God calls Jonah and says, Jonah, go to Nineveh. And Jonah says, I would rather go the complete opposite direction. And he gets on a boat and goes into the sea. And then God flings this storm at Jonah and says, Jonah, go to Nineveh. What does Jonah do? Jonah says effectively, I'd rather die. I'd rather die. If you look back in the context, Jonah chapter 1, verse 6, Jonah is sleeping somehow in the bottom of this boat. The captain comes and says to him, how can you be sleeping? Rise up, call out to your God. Perhaps your God will give a thought to us so we might not perish. They cast lots to find out whose account this evil is going on them. They find out that it's Jonah. They ask Jonah, what did you do? Where are you from? And he says to them, I'm a Hebrew. I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. And they became exceedingly afraid and said, what did you do? They knew that he was fleeing the presence of the Lord. They said to him, verse 11, what should we do that the sea might quiet down for us, because the sea was growing more and more tempestuous? He said to them, pick me up and throw me in the sea. That's his solution, right? So again, Jonah knows why God is after him. And he's in the boat, God's shaking the sea, Jonah, go to Nineveh. And the captain says, hey, call out to your God. Jonah never does. And the men come and say, hey, how do we stop this? He doesn't call out to God. He doesn't say, I had better repent. He doesn't say, oh, turn the boat around, I'll go back to, I'll head to Nineveh. He says, throw me in the ocean. Throw me in the ocean. That's his solution to this problem. They do end up throwing him in the ocean, and in the moment of his distress, he calls out. Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress. And guess what? God answered him. He answered me, out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. That's interesting. Did you see how he said there in verse 3, you cast me into the deep? If you look back in verse 14, it seems very clearly that it was the men who threw him into the water. But in Jonah's moment of distress, his theology has been fixed. Listen again just to the weight of where Jonah's mind is at. It says, I called out to the Lord. He answered me. You heard my voice. You cast me into the deep. Your waves, your billows, your sight, your temple. You brought my life up. Lord my God, I remembered the Lord. My prayer came to you. Your temple. I will sacrifice to you. Salvation belongs to you. See, Jonah's vision has been fixed at this point. He sees that God is the one who appointed the storm. God is the one who appoints this fish. God is the one who is interested in what is happening to Jonah. It's God's sovereign power over Jonah's life is becoming clear here. And so he says, you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All of your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, verse 4, I am driven from your sight, yet I shall look again to your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. At the roots of the mountain, I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. This is Jonah's distress. And last week, Pastor Dave got to tell you a story about his trip deep sea fishing. I'll tell you a story about my trip to the river. I grew up swimming competitively. I was on swim teams most of my childhood. I was a championship swimmer in high school. I was NCAA Division I recruited. I held the state record for about 60 seconds before it was broken the next heat after me. But all of that to say, not to pat myself on the back, but to tell you, I was a pretty strong swimmer. One day in high school, we were with some family friends, and we went down to the river, and we were playing around in the water, and I started getting deeper and deeper into the river, but because I was such a strong swimmer, I didn't really care to think about how far into the river I was going, and I got caught up in the current. And I can tell you, that is a terrifying thing. I mean, I almost drowned. And I went to nationals. I shaved my legs and everything. I was a championship swimmer. Please don't think about that for the whole rest of the evening. I was a strong swimmer. And I almost died. Water always wins. Water's a lot stronger than we give it credit for. And in that moment, and see, I not only was a championship swimmer, I was a lifeguard. As a lifeguard trainer, I had the certification above the certification. And I know very clearly if you ever get caught in the ocean or in the river, you never swim against the current. You swim with the current or to the side of the current. You don't do that. But can I tell you, when the water's drowning you, all you can think about is swimming hard the other way. And that's what I did. I started swimming hard the other way. And I was a great swimmer, but I'm not that strong. And fortunately, by God's grace, I didn't drown. I made it to the side of the shore, way far down, away from the rest of the family. But in that moment, I mean, I was losing my mind. And I can tell you, Jonah, and I don't pretend that my experience was the same as Jonah's, but I can tell you enough to know that getting thrown into the ocean, it is a distressing ordeal for him. So much so that, he thinks he's dead. I'm pretty sure he thinks he's dead, because as you read what he says here, verse 5, the waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. The roots of the mountains went down to the land whose bars closed over me forever. The land whose bars closed over him forever. I think he thinks he's dead. I think he also thinks he's in hell. And did you know there's two bellies, right, at the beginning? Jonah, the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish. Jonah was in the belly of the fish, chapter 2, verse 1. Verse 2, I called out to the Lord out of my distress. He answered me, out of the belly of Sheol I cried. So there's a metaphor going on there. Your version may say out of the depths or out of the deep of Sheol, but the word is literally just, it's belly. It's belly both times. It's a play on words by Jonah here, saying, look, I was in the belly of the fish, but I felt like I was in the belly of the grave. And I would guess for a moment, he probably thought he was dead. And so in that moment of desperation of, I'm about to die or I'm dying, he cries out to God, and God answers him, and God answers him. His life has gone down, and in the depths, as far down as he feels like he could possibly have gone, verse 6, it says, but, 6b, right? I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever, but you brought my life from the pit, O Lord my God. But you raised me up. And we're glad, aren't we? We're glad for the times the scriptures say, but God, but God. It looks bad, but God. In Genesis chapter 8, it looks bad. In fact, God has poured out his wrath on the earth. But God remembered Noah and his family, right? Psalm 73, my heart and my flesh may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Ephesians chapter 2, we're dead in our trespasses. We're by nature children of wrath. But God, being rich in mercy, even when we're dead in our trespasses, God makes us alive together with Christ. By grace you've been saved. We should be grateful for the times in the scriptures where it says, but God. But God doesn't leave us where we deserve to be left. No one questions where Jonah is or why he's there. Jonah had a clear calling from God, and Jonah ran the other way. If God kills Jonah, no one's going to give it a second thought. But God. But God has mercy. But God has mercy. When my life was fading away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came up to you into your holy temple. Verse 8, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope in steadfast love. They forsake their hope in faithfulness. The word there is chesed. Not because you need to know Hebrew do I mention this, but some biblical words in the biblical languages, they transfer over, right? We know agape. If you've been around the church, you know agape means love. You know that. You know, Emmanuel means God with us. Some words from the ancient text, they come over, and that's a good thing. Chesed is one of those words. It's the covenant love of God, the faithful, undying, undeserved, unending love of God that he gives freely to his people. That's the word here. And Jonah says, those who pay regard to these vain idols, these worthless idols, they're forsaking their chance, effectively, at chesed. That kind of love only comes from the Lord. It only comes from the Lord. And he says, those who pay regard to these vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love, faithfulness, faithful love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. I won't forsake you. I won't pay regard to vain idols. I will sacrifice to you, my Lord, my God. And what I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. We don't know what he vowed. We don't know. It could be that at some point what we have here in chapter 2, this isn't Jonah's whole prayer, I'm guessing. This is Jonah coming back later, and I don't know, maybe when you're facing death, you'll utter a prayer like this. I don't think Jonah uttered a prayer like this while he was, going through this. I think he's recalling back onto that time. I'll leave the guys who preached chapter 3 and 4 to tell you whether or not Jonah's whole sermon really was 40 days in Nineveh is toast. We don't know. But I think that as Jonah prays this prayer, he really comes to the place where he understands my only hope is in God. He really comes to his senses, in effect, and says, God, I was dead. I was as good as dead, and yet you rescued me. God. Salvation comes from you. And I think part of the evidence of that is in verse 10. So in chapter 1, verse 17, and chapter 2, verse 10, we kind of have bookends to this whole little account of what happened in the fish. In verse 17, God appoints the fish to swallow Jonah. And then in verse 10 of chapter 2, God speaks to the fish and that it would vomit Jonah up on the dry land. I think Jonah is telling us, as far as God's concerned, Jonah's learned his lesson. And so what we see as we look at Jonah chapter 2 then, is we see this man, this rebellious prophet of God who had a clear calling from God, ran the other way, found himself in a terrible place of distress, and in his most needy moment, in his most stressful moment, in his most, in his weakest, most helpless moment, he turns back to the Lord and worships God from the belly of this fish, and then God delivers him. It's a beautiful prayer. It's a beautiful psalm. There's a lot to learn from it. But here's the problem. Here's the conundrum. If Jonah really means all this, and if God really feels like Jonah has learned his lesson in chapter 2, how in the world do we turn the page to chapters 3 and 4 and finish this book with Jonah sitting on a hill, angry at God because of the salvation that he brings to Nineveh? I mean, Jonah runs the other way from God physically, and then God stops him physically, puts him in the belly of the fish physically, and apparently Jonah repents. And then Jonah goes and he obeys God physically, and he speaks the message that God tells him to speak to Nineveh. And at the end of the story, you find that Jonah's heart is apparently still very far from God and from God's will. But I thought Jonah hit rock bottom. Rock bottom is an interesting concept. I think that when we talk about hitting rock bottom, I think within the confines of the church, we're typically thinking of the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. You know the story about the boy who totally insults his father by asking for his inheritance and then goes away to a foreign land and then loses all the money with loose living. And then one day he finds himself in this pigsty eating pig food, wishing that he could eat the pig food. And he comes to his senses, right? He comes to his senses, and then he says, "Oh, what am I doing? At least in my father's house, even if I was a slave in my father's house, I would eat better than this." He goes, he picks himself up and goes back to his father, and he gets all ready to say, "Father, yeah, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and if you just take me back." But the father comes running to him and doesn't even let him finish his confession, and "Bring the ring, bring the robe, throw the feast, from my son was dead and he's come back to life." And so I think when we talk about hitting rock bottom, we're typically thinking of something like the prodigal son. And honestly, I think that when we think about hitting rock bottom, we sometimes will invoke this story of Jonah and being swallowed by this fish and being as good as dead for 3 days, right? And the problem, brothers and sisters, comes when we take the concept of hitting rock bottom and then we elevate that to the place of repentance and we say, so here's how we know if you're going to get serious with God. Here's how we know if you're going to get serious with God. Have you hit rock bottom or not? Have you hit rock bottom or not? And so the irony here in Jonah's life, in chapter 2, verse 6, he says, "Look, you brought my life up from the pit," which is beautiful because in chapter 1 and verse 14, the sailors cry out to God, let us not perish for taking this man's life. And then God lifts up his life. But what's interesting is in chapter 4, verse 3, Jonah says to God, "Oh Lord, please take my life from me, because it's better for me to die than to live." In verse 8, he says, "It is better for me to die than to live." In his prayer, chapter 2 and verse 8, he says, "Those who pay regard to vain idols, they forsake their hope of hesed." They forsake their hope of this steadfast love. And yet in chapter 4, you find Jonah sitting on the hill angry at God. And he says, chapter 4, verse 2, "Oh Lord, isn't this what I said when I was yet in my country? This is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, abounding in hesed," abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. So Jonah prays this beautiful prayer in chapter 2, and he repents, and you feel like he's hit rock bottom, but you turn the page, and apparently rock bottom wasn't enough. But brothers and sisters, our hope isn't in whether or not we have hit rock bottom. Our hope is in the Lord. Our hope is always only in the Lord. And God, in his grace and in his mercy and his kindness, is faithful to continue to extend the offer of grace to us, to extend the offer of forgiveness to us, to continue to pursue us, to continue to chase after us. And the question for you and I, brothers and sisters, and the question for those around us whom we love, who are not yet in the family of God, the question in our lives and in the lives of the people we love is not, have they hit rock bottom? You'll make yourself crazy wondering if this is really rock bottom. Is this really rock bottom, or could I sink even further? Who knows? It doesn't matter. Because God is a God of grace, and his word and his gospel is powerful to save. It's powerful to save. So the question is not whether or not you've hit rock bottom. The question is, how are you going to respond to the call of God? That's what it says in Hebrews chapter 3, quoting Psalm 95. He says, "Today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart." Don't harden your heart. Hear the gospel, receive the gospel, repent and believe the gospel. You and I, brothers and sisters, we're told by Paul, we're to walk by faith and not by sight. And as we walk by faith and not by sight, and as we live our lives in this world, sure, we'll experience ups and downs. Hopefully they don't go so far down as to involve being swallowed by a fish. But as we live our lives before God, one thing is sure, whether or not we've hit the bottom or the rock bottom, and for those who are yet to believe, for those who are outside of Christ, whether they've hit the bottom or the rock bottom or not yet, the issue is always the gospel. It's God's offer. Will you respond to it? Will you respond to it is always the question. So as we consider these things, what we ought to be grateful for and thankful for is that God is faithful not only to call us, but to answer us when we call to him, and to rescue us when we call to him. And the good news of the gospel is that if anyone, in John chapter 6, listen to what Jesus says. Listen to what Jesus says in John chapter 6. He says, if any come to me, whoever will come to me, I will never cast them out. Whoever will come to me, I will never cast them out. I will never turn them away. Anyone can come to Jesus. And the truth that is being spoken here in Jonah chapter 2, I called to you and you answered. I called to you and you answered. I cried out to you and you lifted up my life and you delivered me. That is the same way that Jesus relates to us today. We can always call on him. We can always answer him. And so what